I first told my dad that I wanted to be an artist, he paused and then told me, "Hope you like buttered noodles." It was kind of prophetic in a way because I did end up liking buttered noodles, but what he was really trying to tell me was, be prepared to struggle and starve. And boy, was he right about that. After graduating high school, I opted not to go to college and instead worked a series of menial jobs until I had enough saved to move to San Francisco. After I moved, I lived in a shared Hunters Point apartment for about 18 months with a bunch of other starving artists as I attempted to break into the local art scene. That was a tough time for me, and for several reasons. There was a lot of crime, a lot of drugs, and outside of the few bucks an hour I got from my part-time bag boy job, I was dead broke. Then, to top it off, I lived with a revolving door of unreliable, egocentric brat spawn who were out there pissing away mommy and daddy's money pretending to be artists, but instead purchased way more pot and pills than they ever did paints or pencils. And I knew I had to start making some money and find a better apartment, because another year with those bums and I'd have gone crazy. And that's when I started job hunting like a son of a bitch, day in and day out for like a month straight. It was exhausting, and when it got to the point where I could feel myself starting to burn out, I began to consider running back home with my tail between my legs before starting afresh in New York when I had the cash saved up again. But then, right when things seemed at their darkest, I met a guy named Greg. We met outside a liquor store when he asked me for a light, and he looked like he was having the worst day of his life. When I asked him if he was okay as I lit a cigarette, he told me he was about to be fired from his marketing job for missing a deadline. He had a project that was 95% completed, but after an agreement with a graphic designer fell through, he was lacking a collection of potential logos for some financial firm his company had as a client. And well, long story short, I got him his logos after working all night and for a heavily discounted rate compared to what he'd promised those deadbeat designers who'd left him high and dry. And that was the start of a very fruitful working relationship between me and dear old Gregory. And off the back of it, I finally got to move out of that pigsty I called an apartment and start living like a human being. Once I started making some serious money, I started looking for nicer single-person apartments around Frisco. And I went to view a couple of sweet places, each with their own individual pros and cons, and I was somewhat undecided until I went to check out a place in Mill Valley. All it said in the ad was that it was a one-bedroom, one-bathroom apartment on a shared property, and that's all there was to it. But when I went to see the thing, I realized just how understated the ad had been. The single-bedroom, single-bathroom apartment turned out to be a guest house built on the grounds of one of those Mediterranean revival villas they got out in that neighborhood. You know the kind, all earthy colors with tiles and archways and columns and whatnot. I met up with the homeowner, an older guy in his 50s or 60s who gave me a quick tour of the guest house before the subject of rent came up. When he told me they wanted just $650 a month for the place, I couldn't believe it, because at the time, that was a very reasonable rate for an apartment of that quality. Not suspiciously reasonable by any stretch, but low enough for me to offer a deposit and the first month's rent there and then. The guy definitely seemed a little wary of me, I guess because I seemed so desperate to move in, so he told me he'd think about it and then let me know. And that's when I told him my story, or part of it anyway. I told him I had this one big shot at living my dream, and I couldn't have the gang of nocturnal drug-addicted losers that I lived with currently messing it up for me. I offered him $700 a month, then $750, which cut even deeper into my earnings, but he said he wasn't interested in more money. He said he needed someone quiet, who minded their own business and who paid in cash and on time. I swore on all the saints in heaven that'd be me, that I'd be too busy working to give a damn what was going on in the big house, and that I'd be damned if I'd be throwing any parties in what I'd considered a workspace. If he gave me the apartment, he wouldn't even know that I was there. The only way that he'd know that I was still alive is getting that envelope full of cash on the first of every month. And aside from that, I'd be a ghost. When I was done, he stood there for a moment and thought about it, and then told me to come collect the keys on the first of the month. I could have danced down that guy's driveway, dude. I was elated. I only had to stay one more week in that pigsty in Hunters Point, and then, on the first of the month, my old pal Greg let me borrow his car to move my stuff, and I was out of there. Now, moving my stuff into that guest house felt like a victory parade. I had steady work, a really nice apartment, and in Greg, I'd made a good friend who wasn't a complete deadbeat. Things really seemed like they were looking up for me. But in the words of some old dead philosopher whose name I can't quite remember right now, sometimes the way up and the way down are one and the same. Which I've always considered to mean that sometimes the things that you think are going to improve your life actually make it way, way worse. And so the first few weeks of living in that guest house were like a dream. I didn't bother the owners, they didn't bother me, I had space to work, and I had a nice quiet place to lay my head each night. I saw my landlord maybe 2 or 3 times in those first few weeks, but I never, ever saw his wife. I mean, to the point that I thought maybe that they were separated and she lived someplace else. Then one day, he comes knocking on my door and tells me that he's going away on a fishing trip over the weekend. He's leaving on Friday evening and then coming back late on Sunday night. I tell him, okay, thanks for letting me know, but then before he leaves, he tells me something like, my wife is feeling a little under the weather, so if she starts acting strangely, don't be alarmed. She's just not feeling like herself lately. I was a little surprised that she was even living there, because, like I said, I'd been there around 3 weeks and hadn't even seen her once. But still, I thanked him for letting me know, and I told him that I'd help out if or when I was needed. That was midweek sometime. Then come Friday, I saw him packing up his truck with a bunch of coolers and stuff, and then wished him a good weekend as I walked toward the guest house. That night was quiet as usual, right up until about 2 in the morning, and I finished up work with the intention of going to bed. I went to the bathroom to take a whiz, and it's Frisco in the late summer, so I got the bathroom window way open so the place doesn't become a giant condensation trap. And then, as I'm taking a leak, I started hearing something outside which caught my attention. It was only very faint at first, but something about it really grabbed my attention. Then as I listened, I realized why. It was the sound of someone crying, and from what I could tell, it was a woman. I finished up my leak and then walked out onto the step outside my front door, trying to work out where the sound was coming from. I stood there, cupping my hands behind my ears like a dumb, red-headed radar tower. It was a trick my dad had taught me as a kid, and just like back then, it worked like a charm. And I quickly figured out that the person crying was around the back of the main house. And that meant that it could only be one person: my landlord's sick wife. Now, I know my landlord had talked about needing his privacy, and I know he'd already told me about his wife feeling under the weather, but I couldn't just hear someone sobbing like that and not at least go check on them. Then, once I was 100% sure that it was someone crying around the corner where the big house's swimming pool was located, I leaned my head around the brickwork and saw a woman sat on a piece of patio furniture. I didn't want to scare her or anything because she had her head in her hands and hadn't seen me lean around the corner, so I made sure to keep my voice as soft as possible and then asked her if she was okay. I was ready for her to jump up, startled, before maybe running back inside the house. But she didn't. She just sat there, her head still in her hands as she continued to sob. Assuming that she hadn't heard me, I repeated myself, asking something like, "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need any help?" Only then did she stop crying. But instead of actually acknowledging my presence, the lady turned her head to look at me and just stared. She looked out at me through the few strands of hair hanging over her eyes, but she didn't say a word. It got so awkward that I spoke for a third time, telling her I was the guy who'd moved into the guest house and that she could call on me anytime she liked if she needed any help or anything. I figured at the very least what I said warranted a murmur of a response, but again, the lady just stared at me kind of blankly, almost like she wasn't looking at me at all, but rather looking through me. I asked her again if she needed anything, but instead of answering me, she looked off into the distance, like in another dimension, then acted like I hadn't said anything at all to her. I just kind of waited, just in case she was building up to say something, and then when she got off of the patio furniture, I expected her to speak. But once again, she didn't say a word. She just got up, turned around, and walked back inside the main house before closing the back door behind her. The whole exchange left me just standing there like, what just happened? But also very concerned for the lady's well-being. This was also way before cell phones were in everyone's pockets, so there was no contacting my new landlord to let him know what I'd seen. But then, to be perfectly honest, even if I did have a cell phone, I'm not sure that I'd have been all that quick at reaching out to him. He told me on multiple occasions how they needed their privacy, how I wasn't to approach the main house unless it was an emergency. And so, unless it was just that, an emergency, I figured my best option was to keep my mouth shut, because I had already run the risk of the landlord's wife telling him, "That new tenant just came creeping up to me in the middle of the night." I mean, that's not what I did, I only wanted to see if she was okay. But who's her husband going to believe? Me or the woman he's been married to for years? And besides, she was back in the house now, safe as any place really, so I just went back to the guest house and got some sleep. The next day was a Saturday, so instead of working all day and most of the night like I usually would, I decided to head over to some of the bars that I used to frequent in Hunters Point before I moved out. I met up with Greg. We had a few beers and talked baseball and then parted ways around midnight. I got a cab home, then as I'm walking up the driveway towards the guest house, I spot someone standing on the second floor balcony of the main house. Someone I was pretty sure was the landlord's wife. I could only see the outline of her because she's standing in the dark with the light of her bedroom shining on some curtains behind her. But on the other hand, I'm lit up like a Christmas tree because I'm walking up the driveway and activating all the security lights attached to the main and guest houses. And I knew she could see me. Or I mean, if she was paying even the smallest amount of attention to her surroundings, she'd have been able to see me, so just as I'm about to split off toward the guest house, I gave her a little wave just to say hi. I don't know what I was expecting after the night before, but just like then, she didn't move a muscle at first. She just stayed perfectly still. Now this is going to sound harsh, but I remember thinking, Jesus, how creepy is this broad? And I also wasn't about to stand there like an idiot, like I had the previous night, so I just walked off towards the guest house. When the guy said his wife was sick, I figured that he meant that she had a cold or something. But by that point, I was starting to think that she was dealing with something more psychological than physical, and that came with a whole set of other concerns on my part. Say she freaked out and it was up to me to do something. I had no idea how to deal with something like that outside of calling 911, and even then, do I ask for the cops? Do I ask for EMS? I wouldn't know what the hell to have done with myself. But then, in the end, it was her who ended up calling the cops on me. On the Sunday morning, same day my landlord is due to come back from his fishing trip, I left my apartment to go get some creamer from the store nearby when I saw the landlord's wife standing on the front lawn. I figured that I was about to get more of that silent treatment because she had her back to me when I saw her. But then once I got level with her as I was walking up the driveway, she heard my footsteps, then turned around, startled. I wasn't even going to bother saying hi at this point, not after the previous 2 attempts, so I just kind of gave her a nod as she looked at me and then kept on walking. But then, instead of ignoring me again, she starts yelling, Hey you! What the hell do you think you're doing on my property?" I was kind of shocked that she even spoke to me, and I had to bite my tongue so I didn't come out with a, "Oh, so now you're talking to me." Instead, and bearing in mind I figured that she might be losing her mind or something, I kept it together and told her very politely that I was the tenant who had been renting her guest house for the past 3 weeks. The lady then told me she had no idea who I was talking about, and that if I didn't get off her property, she was going to call the cops. I told her, "Please don't do that," and explained it had all ended up being a huge misunderstanding. I I even showed her the key that I used to unlock the door and offered to demonstrate me using it so she knew that I wasn't some very casual home invader. And again, I kept my voice down and tried my best to remain very non-threatening, but she marched off after announcing that she was going to dial 911. I remember just shaking my head and telling myself, at least this beats Hunter's Point. And then I went to the store and bought my creamer. But then, when I got back, I look up to see a cop car parked outside the house, and when I rounded that corner to walk down the driveway, I see the landlord's wife angrily gesticulating to very bored-looking officers. My landlord's wife looks past them and sees me and is suddenly saying something like, "There he is! That's him right there!" Like she's expecting the two cops to rush over and just tackle me. But instead, one of them walks over to talk to me while his partner stays with the lady to keep her calm. I started telling the cop my story and then showed him how I could unlock the door to the guest house with the key in my pocket. And after that, I showed him things like my wallet, which I'd left on the table after taking a few bucks out of it, and a few other things confirming that I had been the person who lived there. I also mentioned how the landlord's wife had been acting very weird and that I don't go anywhere near the house usually, so I barely see her, and that's where the confusion is all stemming from. The cop then tells me that the lady seemed to be intoxicated, didn't seem to know where her husband was, and was even confused as to what day of the week it was. In light of that, and considering all my stuff seemed to be in the guest house, the two officers gave me the benefit of the doubt and then escorted my landlord's wife back inside her house. I then filled the cops in on where my landlord was and how, since he was returning home that day, his wife wouldn't be alone for much longer. And that seemed to satisfy the two officers, who told me to call them if anything else happened before departing. A few hours later, my landlord arrives back from his fishing trip, and I caught him in the driveway to tell him what had happened with his wife. I didn't tell him that I approached the house, but I did say that I'd heard her crying, and then all the stuff about her calling the cops on me. He didn't seem to react until I mentioned the cops, like he acted as if it was only some minor concern until I mentioned the two officers showing up and how they took a look around the guest house. Then, and only then, did he act like this was a priority, and he promised me that it wouldn't happen again before he stormed off, presumably to confront his wife. Now don't get me wrong, I was glad that he seemed to be on my side in this whole situation, because awkward encounters with his wife were one thing, but her trying to get me arrested was something else. But then, having said that, there was something that really bugged me about the way that he reacted when I told him about the cops showing up. He seemed to act like his wife's behavior was a regular occurrence, as in, he seemed only mildly disappointed. But then when I mentioned the police, his ears pricked up, and his expression changed completely. I get that he'd probably just gotten used to his wife having outbursts or whatever, and that the cops being called represented what you might call an unnecessary escalation. But to me, it seemed kind of fishy that he seemed so uptight about the cops taking a look around his property, even if it was the one that I was renting and not his actual house. And needless to say, things didn't end there. I've been staying in the guest house apartment for around 3 months when Greg came by to pick me up from the apartment. We had tickets to a Giants game, and I was psyched to be going because I loved sports since pretty much forever. And so there's me, jumping into Greg's passenger seat like, "Hey buddy, how's it going?" But Greg, he looks like he'd just seen a ghost. And I say something like, "What the hell's gotten into you?" But he replied to a question with a question, saying something like, "You live in that place?" He was talking about the guest house and main house together, the grounds I mean, so I told him sure, that living in the guest house was a pretty sweet deal. Greg then asked me if I knew the folks who lived there, or more importantly, what happened to the folks who lived there. I told him no, and Greg sighed, and then we drove off toward Candlestick Park, and he told me the story on the way. About 5 years before I had moved to San Francisco, there had been a high-profile missing persons case involving the daughter of a wealthy pharma rep. One day, she told her parents that she was going to walk down to the local park and then never came home again. They called the cops the day afterwards after calling around to all her friends' houses, but they couldn't find any witnesses whatsoever that had seen her anywhere near the park that day, It was like she disappeared into thin air. The girl's heartbroken parents held a bunch of press conferences outside their home for the benefit of local news. In each one, they begged people to come forward with any information they might have, saying that someone must know where their daughter is and what happened to her on the day she vanished. Greg, being a local, had seen some of the many news reports, and with him being a high school senior at the time, it had a profound effect on him and his friends at school, because the missing girl had been the exact same age group as them, a high school senior. So when he pulled outside the house that afternoon and looked out of his window at it, he knew he recognized it from somewhere. He just couldn't think where. Then by the time I'd climbed into the passenger seat, he remembered where he'd seen it before. It had been in those press conferences. The missing high school girl was my landlord's daughter. As you can imagine, learning all that meant our baseball game had something of a dark cloud hanging over it, and we spent almost the entire game talking about the missing girl, my landlady's wife, and how it all made horrible and sudden sense to me. The wife wasn't nuts. I mean, she might have been going nuts, but all the crying and the standing on the balcony, staring into the night, she was just broken by grief, and from the way that she was acting, was probably stuck at the bottom of a bottle, be it booze or pills or whatever she was using. Greg told me the girl had never been found, but after 5 long years and not a single clue as to where she went, pretty much everyone assumed that she'd been murdered by a suspect who was later given the name the Golden State Killer. Everyone hoped that she'd just run away from home, and she'd show up one day for some delayed but happy ending. But deep down, everyone suspected otherwise. Something terrible had happened to that girl, and she was never coming home. I felt terrible for the landlord and his wife, and I wish I'd known earlier so I didn't treat the wife like she was just some crazy old coot. But looks, as they say, can be very deceiving. A few weeks after I found out all that stuff about their missing daughter, I noticed my shower was on low pressure, and since it happened to be the same day my rent check was due, I figured I'd walk over to the house, deliver my rent check, and let the landlord know about the water pressure at the same time. So I grab the check, and I walk over there, but then right as I'm about to press their doorbell, I hear the landlord having an argument with his wife about something, and they are screaming at each other. I hear the husband yelling something about how his wife is always feeling sorry for herself, and he goes off like that for a few seconds before I hear his wife scream something back like, "I wouldn't be like this if it wasn't for what you did." My landlord then responds with, "What I did? What I did? Are you forgetting it was you who got us into this mess in the first place?" And that was the point where I was like, okay, I really shouldn't be listening to this. And I walked back to my apartment, wrote a note about the water pressure on the back of my rent envelope, and then went back to the door to slide it under it. When I did, there was no more yelling, so I figured that they were just done with their fight and then went back to my day as usual. Not long after, I mentioned to Greg that I was thinking about trying to find a new place. He told me that that didn't surprise him at all, and that to him, it wouldn't be a tough decision in the first place. But that was real easy for him to say because he didn't have to live with the reality of this situation. I figured that the only reason my landlord was renting out his guest house was because they needed the money, and because most people in the city were aware of the tragedy they suffered. They must have had a hell of a time trying to find the vacancy until my ignorant ass strolled up to their driveway and just said, "Oh wow, isn't this a nice place?" If I just walked out on them, God knows what kind of financial difficulties that might leave them in. I mean, I know it's just a few $100 a month, but they were older folks, and sometimes that kind of money makes all the difference in retirement, or if you got a sick wife who needs taken care of. I knew I'd feel like a bag of crap just leaving them like that, but at the same time, I wasn't sure how long I could go on living with them. It was like there was this very dark cloud hanging over the house, the same one that followed me home from the game that afternoon. And then, if I'm allowed to swap metaphors for a second, there was the ticking time bomb element to it as well. Whatever that lady was taking to manage her grief, she was either taking too much or not enough, and the way that they were fighting with each other made me think that it was only a matter of time before something happened. I had no idea what that something might be, but you knew it was coming, and when it did, I sure as heck didn't want to be there when it went down. And so another few weeks go by, and by this time we're into late October, right around Halloween. The house had been quiet. I've gone back to never seeing that wife around, and I'm actually starting to think that I was a little hasty in looking for someplace else to live. The place had its flaws, but so did everywhere else, and I also felt like kind of an asshole for making things about me when it was their grief, their cross to bear, so to say. Maybe the best thing for me to do was to stop thinking about it and remind myself that it wasn't any of my business, and that worked just fine, until it became my business, and in a way that I could never have imagined. So, it's November 3rd of 1989, and I remember that because it was a Friday and I was about to go step onto the old tiles there to get a few beers with Greg. I finished work at around 4 p.m., took around 15 minutes to get ready, then as I step out of the guest house and start walking down the driveway, I see a whole bunch of cops turn onto the driveway and start walking in the direction of that big house. I couldn't help myself, seeing them come up the driveway in their uniforms like that, so I blurted out, "A little late for trick-or-treating, isn't it, fellas? Why don't you take off those costumes there?" But I didn't get to finish that last sentence because when they realized that I was there, standing off to the side of them, they all pulled out their guns and their holsters, spun around, and started yelling at me to put my hands in the air. It makes me laugh to think about it nowadays, but I was so scared that I had this perfect brain fart of a moment, and instead of yelling "don't shoot," or something like that, I literally screeched out, "It was a joke! It was just a joke!" But then, as they're approaching me, telling me to get down on the ground, it hit me that the goddamn landlord's wife had called the cops on me for a second time. I'm lying on my face, they're putting the cuffs on me, and I'm telling them things like, "Officers, there's probably been some kind of confusion here, if you just let me explain." But unlike the first time around, when the cops were actually calm and polite and whatnot, one of them yells at me to shut up, and then I'm being arrested. They're acting tough, like I was the scum of the earth, but still I'm just calmly telling them that there's been a misunderstanding, and that I rent the guest house on the property. Again, one of the cops tells me to shut my mouth, and then as two of them start walking me back to their paddy wagon, the others walk off towards the house talking about securing it, stuff like that. I kept my mouth shut, but I was still acting kind of smug because I knew that when all was said and done, I was just going to file a complaint on each one of those stuck-up pricks for arresting me on the charge of living in my own goddamn apartment. One time I could understand, but two, and the way they did it, that's just not going to happen, not in this lifetime. Now anyways, they take me down to the old Mill Valley Police Precinct, and I'm still 100% sure that they're arresting me by accident. But then, when we got to this booking process and they read out the charges, I realized something seriously messed up was going on. I'd been arrested on suspicion of kidnap, false imprisonment, a bunch of other smaller charges, and then get this, the cops charged me with, quote, practicing medicine without a license. That was the point where I lost my cool and I was like, what the hell are you people talking about? Because kidnap and all that other scary stuff was one kind of nightmare. But then, the practicing medicine thing, hearing that made it feel like I was trapped in some fever dream. They might as well have told me that I'd been charged with lettuce and bacon because what I was hearing made exactly 0% sense to me. I knew not to talk to the cops without a lawyer present, so I didn't say a word, and they didn't really ask me anything of substance until the attorney showed up and we could start in earnest. But then, instead of asking questions about me, they seemed very interested in my landlord. They asked me where he was, and I told them fishing trip, but then they acted like that was some kind of cover story. One of them yelled, bullcrap, we know he's not fishing, where is he? Then told me all about how, if I didn't cooperate, they were going to make sure that I got a full rap on each charge and not just accessory, basically telling me that I was going to prison for the rest of my life if I didn't start telling them the truth. Obviously, I had no clue what they were talking about, so I told them a second time that, to my knowledge, I had no idea where my landlord was. He just told me that he was fishing, and I have no reason not to believe him. The cops then asked me a whole bunch of questions about when I moved into the guest house, what I did for work, things like that. They also asked me a ton of questions about my relationship with my landlord, like if I was close with him. I told him hell no, that he'd actually warned me to stay the hell away from the house because they needed their privacy, quote unquote. And if he was involved in something shady that they were trying to pin on me also, then they were barking up the wrong tree. I then told him that I'd be happy to help with any kind of investigation, especially since the charges sounded so crazy and I wanted to distance myself as much as I possibly could from them. The cops didn't exactly warm up to me after that, but they sure as hell stopped treating me like something they'd found in the bottom of their shoe. They let me go not long after taking me back to a cell, but warned me not to leave town because I could still be rearrested at any time. They wouldn't tell me exactly what was going on, only that I might not be seeing my landlord or his wife for a while, which might affect my living arrangements. And that was the last thing I wanted to hear, and I figured that I was back to shopping for apartments again. But not only was I wrong about that, but I was wrong about my other theory too, which pertained to why cops seemed so interested in finding my landlord. See, the whole kidnapping and imprisonment thing really rattled around my brain as I caught a cab back to the apartment. It might sound crazy to say it, but I thought my landlord might have, I don't know, found the son of a bitch who took his daughter all those years ago. But then, the practicing medicine thing, combined with the kidnapping, that gave me chills just thinking about it. Because think about it, what kind of messed up stuff are you doing to someone where that becomes a factor? Was he torturing a guy? Performing a surgery on him? Just what the hell was going on? I didn't find out the whole truth until much later, but like I must have said a dozen times by now, it was like nothing I ever could have imagined. Since I didn't have anyone to pay rent to, I just stayed in the apartment until the water and electricity were just shut off, and then ended up staying on Greg's couch, with the guest house acting as storage until I found a new place to live. This all took place over the course of around 2 months, with news about my landlord coming out in steady drip until, finally, all the pieces fit together. But probably the biggest one came when the cops found my landlord's daughter. Not dead, not alive, but somewhere in between. In a small rented home up in Los Ranchitos, the cops found my landlord's missing daughter. She was emaciated, bedbound on life support, and appeared to have been in some kind of deep coma for the last half a decade. My landlord had been keeping his daughter alive, apparently after she'd received some kind of serious head trauma, and he had been doing so using medical equipment he'd obtained from some mysterious but obviously well-equipped donor, most likely as a result of his contacts in the medical industry. But then, why not take her to a hospital to get her the proper medical attention? Why leave her to slowly rot in some roach-infested apartment up in the hills? Because it was my landlord's wife who inflicted the crippling head wound in the first place. I guess it all came out once they got arrested and the daughter's location was uncovered. I don't know who spilled the beans first, but someone did, and once the news broke, it was a hot story for a few days. At least until the news cycle switched back to the more interesting story, which was the aftermath of the Loma Prieta earthquake and all the various rescue and rebuilding efforts. 5 long years ago, my former landlord's wife and daughter got into one hell of a fight. I don't think they ever found out what it was over, but it was bad enough that the daughter ended up smacking her mom across the face. My landlord's wife then loses her mind, grabs some heavy ornament off of a sideboard, and then whack, smacks her daughter over the head with it. I guess she either hit her really goddamn hard or landed the blow with a sharp edge or something, because her daughter passed out right away and then just never woke up again. And then afterwards, instead of doing the right thing and having the mom sent to prison, they agreed to cover the whole thing up, keep their daughter alive, and then hope that they could find a way to wake her up someday. Obviously, they didn't wake her up, and after a long multi-agency investigation, my landlord was followed to the Los Ranchitos apartment, where his bedridden daughter was then discovered. I couldn't believe that I'd been sharing a space with people like that, and that I'd rationalized everything I'd seen and heard to the point that I actually felt sorry for them. What they'd done was terrible, an evil thing, but they did it out of a warped sense of love and family preservation. And that's the thing that I find most haunting about this whole messed up situation. I don't think that they were bad people, but they did a terrible, awful thing, both of them. And if normal, everyday people are capable of stuff like that, then to me, it makes the world seem like a much darker and much scarier kind of place. Back in the late summer of 2009, I was just about to start graduate school and I had to find myself a new flat for the coming year. I was new to the area, so I didn't know the neighborhoods at all, and since I needed something cheap and cheerful, I ended up browsing vacancies in some of the city's less affluent areas. Some of the listings were frankly terrifying, and I'm surprised the landlords had the balls to even really advertise them. Others, however, were considerably more livable, or at least they appeared that way thanks to some carefully chosen angles and a lot of window shots. Over the course of a week, I'd booked 10 different viewings, and by the end of the third day, I was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. A playful exaggeration on my part, of course, but honestly, it was just so draining. I'd been to 6 of the 10 viewings that I had lined up, and each and every one had been a complete letdown. The places were either riddled with mold, obnoxiously close to a restaurant or bar, so that they stank of old chip oil and cigarette smoke, or they were the size of a friggin' shoebox. And luckily, my next viewing, which was late in the afternoon the following day, was with a landlady that had advertised a females-only listing. The pictures of the place made it seem quite nice, and I was very attracted to the idea of living in a segregated space because of the added security it'd bring. I know maybe to some of you that might sound a little bit cynical, and I'm well aware it's not all men who pose a problem, but in the context of what I'm about to tell you, I refuse to apologize for my cynicism, or as other girls might phrase it, realism. Some guys are just creeps, it's a fact of life. So the idea of living with just girls in a shared house was massively appealing. But then, that'd be massively appealing to just about any girl moving to or living in London. Surely getting a viewing appointment would be impossible. But then, it wasn't. I got one within a few days, which I thought was me getting lucky. But really, that should have been my first red flag. I was just way too optimistic to see it. The next day, as I got the bus over towards Camden, I remember being this mix of excited and nervous. I had so much faith in the place, and I texted with the landlady, a woman named Jan, so I was confident that it was going to be a decent place. But then at the same time, I'd been let down so relentlessly over the past few days that I had this looming sense of dread as I got closer and closer to my stop. At the time, I thought it was just residual trauma from being continually disappointed, but now, I'm starting to think it was more like a kind of spidey sense. And so I got off the bus and immediately texted Jan to let her know that I was nearby, which she'd asked me to do because she said that she was really busy and might need a reminder. She texted me back almost right away, but when I expanded the message notification, I saw it was a lot more than just a simple okay or thanks, see you soon. It said something like, "Hi, I've been terribly busy, so my brother-in-law will be there to let you in and show you around." So much for female only, right? I thought that was the whole selling point. But then I understood that Jan was probably a very busy lady if she owned several properties all over London, so I wasn't about to throw my rattle out of my pram over one little thing like that. And so, off I went to meet up with Jan's brother-in-law and to view what could potentially be my brand new home. So I got there, and the flats were in a unit above a line of shops. I'd been instructed to knock on the door, and so I did, and when the door opened, I saw Jan's brother-in-law standing in the threshold. He looked weird, and that's putting it nicely. And the way he looked at me in the first moments we made eye contact made me feel a lot less comfortable than I did before. I mean it when I said that I'm not some man-hater, but I wasn't at all pleased about having to deal with a man in the female-only flat complex, especially not since he was giving off these creepy vibes. If that was any other circumstance, and there's no way I'd have stepped into an empty room with that guy, but I'd pinned almost all my flat-finding hopes on this place, so I put on a brave face and a polite voice and then stepped inside and followed him to the flat. As soon as we stepped inside, my heart sank. It wasn't remotely like it was advertised, not just because it already looked like there was someone living there, but like, I'm pretty sure the pictures weren't even the same place. I asked Jan's brother-in-law when the current tenant was due to vacate, and my heart sank again when he said something like, "Well, yeah, that's the thing. The property we're going to show you it's been taken off the market, and this is the only one we've got available for you in this area, and it's a shared unit." And that was all very disappointing to hear, devastating even, but the thing that mattered most was securing somewhere to live and making sure it was female only. Potentially I could cope with a new flatmate, so long as she was a girl, but when I asked the guy if the current tenant was female, he literally ducked the question. I asked him, plain as day, "Is it still an all-female occupancy?" And he responded with, "If you'd follow me this way, I can show you the vacant bedroom and attached bathroom." Then he just trotted off like I hadn't asked him anything and opened up the bedroom. I followed him, thinking I might as well have a look at the room, and while it wasn't actually all that bad compared to some of the others I'd seen, he still hadn't answered my question about the unit being female only. I had to look around the bedroom and remain polite as I asked him once again if the unit was female only or not, and the man sort of wiggled his head and made a face that said he wasn't sure, and then said he'd have to contact Jan to make sure because he didn't know off the top of his head. I was starting to get really annoyed, but I kept my cool as he asked if I wanted to see the attached bathroom. I was literally on the verge of just saying no when he stepped forward and opened up the door. Then as he did, I was hit with this truly revolting smell. It was so bad that I winced, and I know the guy saw me wince from how rank the smell was, so when I said, "No thanks, I think I'd like to have another look at the kitchen," I'm pretty sure that he knew that I was lying, unless he really was as stupid as he looked. Honestly, I just wanted to get away from the smell, and I didn't care at all what the kitchen looked like when the bathroom bloody stank, so I was actually just going to walk towards the front door and see myself out after a brief and very passive-aggressive word of thanks. But then, as I walked, something clicked about all the stuff that was left around the flat. By that point in my life, I'd lived with girls and only girls, even from when I was a kid. My dad wasn't around and it was just me, my sister, and my mom. Then, when I left for uni, I only lived with girls there too. And not to be too crass, but I knew what boys' bedrooms looked like too, and that's what clicked in my head as I walked through the last flat. It looked like a man lived there. And of course I knew that it was a man living there because the guy wouldn't answer my bloody question, but it seemed like a certain type of man lived there. And this is where I made a huge error of judgment. I put it down to the continual disappointment and the stress of thinking that I was going to be forced to pick some absolute crap house to be miserable in for the next year plus. But when I realized that it wasn't just any old man living there, but the one currently showing me around, it all started falling into place for me. I got out my phone, called Jan's number, and as the guy followed me out of the bedroom, his phone started to ring in his pocket. I wasn't supposed to have his number, was I? He was just supposed to be meeting me there, so having the phone that Jan was texting from start ringing in his pocket, that confirmed all my worst suspicions about this man. And he knew it too. He knew I'd rumbled him, and I wish that I was wearing a bloody GoPro because the look on his face was one I wish that I had framed as a picture hanging in my bathroom. I think that's the other thing that did it too. How I sort of, sensed his weakness. I'd caught some absolute waste man trying to trick desperate girls into living in a spare room it looked like he'd built himself, and with some really dodgy plumbing too by the smell of things. Red-handed, that was the phrase that came into my head in the moment. Red bloody-handed, and I'd be damned if I was about to let him live it down. I remember trying to think of something witty to say, but all I could think of was to ask him the exact question in mind, I suppose by way of humiliation, and so I started asking him, "Were you trying to trick young girls into living with you, yeah?" His face was like a tomato. But he still tried denying it, and the indignation that I felt from his denial only spurred me on. I started telling him how pathetic he was, what a pervert he was, how he was probably on the sex offenders registry. I gave him both barrels, as they say, didn't hold back in the slightest, but I forgot the golden rule when dealing with men. They're bigger, they're stronger, and the mental midgets among them are only one piece of wounded pride away from using that to their advantage. I saw the moment I pushed him over the edge, and it really was like that meme of, and it was in that moment she knew she effed up. He stopped trying to talk, gave up on denying everything, then started marching towards me with this wild look in his eyes. I knew he was going to go for me, and I got a head start on running down the corridor to the block's entrance, but he was just too fast. I almost got to the door and just about had my hand on the latch when I felt something tugging on my hair. I felt the pressure on my scalp, and then the next thing, my neck jerked back as the guy got a handful of my hair and started trying to drag me backwards. I tried to stay on my feet, but the force of him pulling my head back knocked me off my balance, and then as I fell backwards, I realized that he was actually trying to drag me back towards the flat using nothing but my hair. I remember screaming for help and hoping someone would appear from the other flats, of which there were maybe 3 or 4 on that floor of the block. But if they were occupied, whoever lived in them must have been at work or dead, because I screamed so hard that my nose started to bleed and no one emerged from any of the doors. Once I realized that I was on my own like that, and we were just feet away from him dragging me back into his flat, I tried to flip myself over so I could at least stand up. But right when I found a bit of purchase on the carpet underneath, I felt something slam into my face so hard it made the vision in my left eye go all white. I brought a hand up to my face covering that eye, and with my free hand I made a desperately futile attempt to get his hand off of my hair. But the second my hand touched his, and I tried digging my nails into the skin of his hand, he tugged violently on my hair again and sent me crashing down onto my knees. I remember how, as I reached the doorway, he tried to drag me through it, but I made it very hard on him by blindly kicking and throwing punches, anything to try and get him in the gonads or scratch his eyes out. But then, after making contact with at least one of my swings, I have a gap in my memory, presumably from where the guy hit me so hard that I fell unconscious for a minute or two. And my last memory of trying to fight him off of me was as we reached the door. But then the next I remember, I was on the bedroom floor, and he was dragging me towards the bathroom that stank of mold and rotten God knows what. There was this pain in my neck when I woke up, and I remember having this deep fear that if I tried to twist my way up so I could bite him, that he might tug on my hair hard enough to break my neck. I was more terrified than I've ever been in my entire life. I had no idea what was happening. But the one thing I did know is that if he managed to get me into that bathroom, it was all over for me. I remember rolling over and how it made my scalp burn with pain from all the hair that got ripped out, but it allowed me to kind of wheel around and grab the guy's wrists. He obviously thought that I was unconscious still, so when I suddenly started moving, it took him totally by surprise, and I was able to sink my teeth in the skin of his wrist until I saw his fingers open and felt my hair come loose from his grip. I tried to run, but he grabbed me again, only that time I just remember sort of launching myself at his face. He was trying to pin my arms by my sides by wrapping his own around me, but I raised them too early for him to get them, and just started digging my fingernails into his eyes. It was so horrible because I could feel the bare flesh of his eyeballs giving way under my nails, and it really makes me shudder to think about now. But at the time, all I could think about was doing as much damage as possible. And it worked. He screamed so loud that it hurt my ears, and then he suddenly shoved me off of him so hard that I went tumbling to the floor. I felt so dizzy that I struggled to find my feet, but it didn't matter because the man intent on ending my life, and God knows what else before that, was in such pain from me scratching his eyes that he couldn't see. He was covering them with both of his hands, screaming terrible, terrible, terrible things at me. But I listened to all of that as I was running towards the front door, knowing that there was no chance of him catching up to me. I remember coming out into the street outside and walking down the metal stairs which led up to the unit really fast, and then some woman saw me as she was walking past and was like, "Oh my God, are you okay?" I had a cut on my face from where he'd hit me. I'm guessing that was the blow that knocked me out too, and it had been pouring blood down me without me realizing. Then, when I saw just how much blood there was, I was terrified that he might have stabbed me or something, so I unzipped my jacket and started looking for stab wounds while saying to the woman to call the police, call the police. More and more people came over because the way I looked and the way I was shouting was obviously attracting a lot of attention. I kept pointing to the door that I went through and came out saying, he's in there," because I felt my legs getting weak and